Hello and welcome back. In this episode we're going to take a look at how we can manage state in a Flutter application using inherited notifiers, which are an extension of inherited widgets. So what I've done is I've created a brand new Flutter application. As you can see here we have our main.dart file. This is the essentially sample application that Flutter generates for you when you create a new application. As you can see here over on the right, I have the Android emulator running with the application being served in the background. You can see here we have the Flutter demo homepage, and we can see we've pushed the button 0 times, and if we start pushing the button, you can see that it increments the counter on the number of times that we have pushed the button. So if we come down to the My Homepage class, you'll notice that this is a stateful widget, because inside the My Homepage state class, you'll notice that we have this set state. So that means that this widget is essentially a stateful widget. It manages this counter state internally. So you'll notice that's initialized to 0, which is what we saw when it first loaded and opened up. And then we can see we have this increment counter method, which is called when we press the floating action button down here. And that essentially increments the counter within this set state. And that's what updates the UI of the application every time we essentially press that button, increment that counter by 1 each time, and then that's what triggers the UI to update to show that updated incremented value. Now, of course, this sort of local set state within the home page is perfect if you just have something that you are managing statefully within the one page. But what if you have a variable that is used by multiple pages? It can start getting quite messy if you have sort of callback functions in each of your pages to update other pages and various sort of other sort of really quite convoluted ways to update the state in multiple places when you just have this sort of one value referenced. And so what we're going to look at in this episode is how we can essentially lift out this state from being localized within the page to using an inherited notifier. And that inherited notifier will allow us to use the state throughout the application in as many or as few pages as we like. So what we're going to want to do first of all is we're going to want to create a class to store our state data in. So down here at the bottom, I'm going to create a new class, and I'm going to call it counter state data. And this is going to extend a change notifier, like so. And essentially this counter state data class is going to store the value of this counter variable here, like so. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy that down, say int counter equals 0. And then what I am going to do is inside this class, I am going to create a getter and a setter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say int get counter, and that is going to return counter, like so. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say set counter, and we're going to pass in an integer value like so. And inside here, I'm going to do a check to see if a counter not equal to the value that we pass in. So essentially, if the current counter is not equal to whatever value we're passing in on the setter, then I'm going to say counter equals value, like so. And then I'm going to call notify listeners. And that notify listeners is going to trigger any pages that are listening to this state to essentially rebuild the UI to display that new value. Otherwise, that new value will be stored in code, but it won't be reflected in the UI of the application. It will still be displaying the old value. So that's essentially our counter state data done like so. And what I'm then going to do is create our actual counter state class. And this is going to extend inherited and notifier, like so. And if we click on the little red squiggle there, we can see that we need to create a constructor to call super. And if we take a look inside the inherited notifier, you'll notice that we have this constructor that we need to fill in. So it takes in a key, it takes in a notifier, and it takes in a required child widget. You can also see on the inherited notifier we have this type T, extends listenable. And if we take a look at the notifier property within this class, you'll notice it's of type T. So this notifier is our change notifier that we created as our state data class. So what we can do is we can say counter state data, like so. And then inside this counter state, we are going to say a key, like so. And then we're going to say required, and then counter state data. And this is going to be our notifier. And then we're going to also have our required child widget, like so. Then what we can do in this super call, we can say key of key. We can then say notifier of notifier. And then last but not least, we have our child, like so. And what we can also do is make this a constant constructor to get rid of that little squiggle there, like so. And so that is our counter state class created. And you can see it references our counter state data. And what we can now do is add a static method inside this counter state in order to be able to get access to our counter state data, our notifier, from any page of our application. Now this follows a similar pattern. You'll notice here on line number 50, we're doing this theme of context, which allows us to get access to our theme state data, essentially in that instance. So what we can do is we can create a static method in here that's going to return our counter state data. So we can say static and counter state data of, and that's going to take in a build context, like so. And what we can then do within here is we can say return context dot, and then we can see we have a couple of depend on inherited element and depend on inherited widget of exact type. And we want this depend on inherited widget of exact type. So we can say depend on widget of exact type, and we can specify the type of our inherited widget, which is counter state. This extends inherited notifier, which in turn extends inherited widget. So we are depending on inherited widget of exact type counter state, like so. And then we can say notify, like so. And you'll notice we're popping our essentially bang operator in there with those exclamation marks. And that's basically saying depend on inherited widget of exact type, and I'm going to assure you that it is not null. You'll notice that in the null safety versions of Flutter, some of the state classes will have a maybe of static method, and that maybe of will return null if it can't find a counter state inherited notifier within the widget tree. Whereas in this instance of, it's saying, okay, try and find one, and if this returns null, i.e. if it can't find a counter state class, then it will essentially throw an exception, which is what that exclamation mark there is denoting with regards to null safety. So there's our counter state data of static method inside our counter state class. And what we can now do is we can set this up within our application. So you'll notice in our material app, inside our MyApp class, we are just returning this material app straight up from the build method. However, what we are going to want to do is wrap the material app in our state class. So what we can do inside our MyApp class, or whatever class you've called your application, we can come into here and we can say final counter state data. Final counter state data, and we can say counter state data equals and counter state data, like so. And then we can see here this is no longer a constant constructor, so we can get rid of that const from the MyApp constructor, and also from there, like so. And what we are going to want to then do is wrap our material app in this counter state data. So what we can do is we can say a wrap with widget, and we can say counter state. You'll recall that counter state is our inherited widget. So that's what we're going to wrap the app with. I notice that we then get a bunch of squiggles because we can see the parameter notifier is required. So what we can then do is we can say notifier, and that is our counter state data. And essentially what we can then do, last but not least, is we can come up to this stateless widget, use our IntelliSense to convert this into a stateful widget. You can see there we can now pop the const back on my app like so. And with this being a stateful widget now, if we come into the myAppState class, what we can do is we can override the dispose method. So you'll see this state class has a dispose method that we can override. And within here we're going to call super.dispose, and just above that we are going to say counter state data.dispose. And that will essentially dispose our change notifier when the application is disposed. So with this counter state now wrapping our material app, if we come down to our My Homepage class, we can now convert this into a stateless widget. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to convert that into a stateless widget like so. You'll notice this create state method is then no longer valid. And what we're going to want to do is copy our build method from our state class. And we're going to want to pop it up into our stateless widget. We can now safely get rid of our state class, the My Homepage state class. And if we now come back up into our My Homepage class, you'll notice we've got a couple of squiggles on this counter variable and this increment counter method. So what we are going to do, first of all, this counter here, what we're going to do is we're going to say counter state dot of context, exactly like we're doing with the theme data. We're going to do that exactly the same with this counter state data. And you'll notice this of method gives us our counter state data change notifier class. And that's the class down here that stores our actual counter value within. So what we can do from in here is simply say dot and then counter, like so. And you'll notice this will then output the value of our counter into this text widget. And then you'll notice we have this onPressed increment counter method. If we come down to our counter state data class, you'll notice we have just a getter and a setter, but we don't have an increment method. So what we can do is we can create a new method in here called increment, like so. And what we can do in here is we can say counter, counter plus plus, like so, and then notify listeners. So what this increment method will do is it will increment the value of counter by 1. So if it's 0, it will become 1, 2, 3, etc. And then it will notify listeners, much like we've done in the setter, because we need to call notify listeners to update the UI. Otherwise, the value will just change in this class, in the code, but it won't be reflected in the UI of the application. So with that increment method, what we can now do inside here is we can say counter state dot of context, and then we can say dot increment, like so. And you'll notice that every time we now press this floating action button, we will now call the increment method of counter state, and that increment method will then increment the value of counter by 1 and notify the listeners to update the UI of the application. So with all of this in place, if we pop a breakpoint just on that increment method inside this counter state data so that we can see what happens, and if we now do a hot restart of the Flutter application. So you can see we've hot restarted, the value of the counter is now back to 0, it's now been reset. And if we click on this little plus button here, you'll see that we come into our increment method. We can see the value of counter is 0, and then if we step over that line, we can see that counter has been incremented. And so if we continue, we can see that we have pushed the button once. And if we then keep pushing up, we can see 6, 7, etc., so on, so forth. So essentially, that has shown you how you can lift the state from just being localized within a stateful page of your application or stateful widget, and we've lifted that up to be above the actual application itself using this counter state wrapping around the material app widget. And this counter state takes in our counter state data class, and it's our counter state data class that extends change notifier so that we can call notify listeners, and it's this class that actually stores the value of the counter, the actual state itself. This counter state class simply extends from inherited notifier, and it's this essentially counter state class that we wrap around our entire application, and this gives us access using the static of method. It gives us access down to our actual counter state data to be able to get into that state. And as I say, in the home page, we've then replaced our local state with notify listeners with simply counterstate.of context, which follows the exact same pattern as theme of context, media query of context, etc., so on and so forth. And what we can then do with this is we can use this in any of our pages of our application to access that exact same shared state throughout the entire application, regardless of whatever page or widget we are on. So that's quite useful for when you have a state that isn't just used in one page, but used in multiple pages throughout the application. That allows you to lift that state up above the application level itself, and then share it between all of the pages of the application using this counterstate.of context, and then whatever you have stored in your counterstate data class. So I hope you found this episode useful. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.